It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind. It either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Zia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
I'm Robert Edgington from Northwest Indiana, and you're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you tonight. I accidentally released Friday night show. It was a members-only show, and I moved to a new platform, and my fat fingers hit the wrong button. So, apologize to the members, to everyone else. Enjoy the show. Hope your weekend's going well. Tonight, we're going to be talking with Timothy Renner and Joshua Cutchins. And everyone knows Timothy Renner from his podcast, Strange Familiars. If you get a chance, check it out. But the guys wrote a book, and the book is called Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 1, Folklore. A very cool book, actually. There's a lot of weird coincidences from the past up until today, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight regarding Sasquatch, some of the weird things that people talk about, and how does it relate to the past. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com, and if you get a chance to check out sasquatchchronicles.com, you can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome to the show Timothy Renner. Tim, thanks for coming on.
Oh, Wes, thanks for having me back. You know, Sasquatch Chronicles is my favorite, so I'm always happy to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate it, brother. And we also have Joshua Cutchin. Is it okay if I call you Josh?
Oh yeah, just don't call me late for dinner.
Yeah, welcome to the show, Josh. I really appreciate you being here, man. And
it's an absolute pleasure. I'm a longtime listener, and this is, as I was mentioning to you before, like this is like the last item on my podcast bucket list of places that I've been a long-time listener and haven't spoken yet. So thank you for having me on here. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah, no. The pleasure's mine. Thank you again for coming on. And we're going to talk about your guys' book. I bought it off of Amazon. I know I could have gotten a free copy, but I don't believe in people giving away their work for free. So I wanted to get my own copy. And actually, I was just telling Tim and Josh, I love the book. I love the cover. It's called Where the Footprints Ends, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 1, Folklore. The little I've read into it, just because I haven't had a chance to really sit down and read the whole book, I was really impressed with it, guys. It's very well put together. Who wants to start? What made you guys kind of write this book together?
Well, I started it, and I looped Josh in because Josh had just finished writing his last book, which was about alien abduction and the changeling phenomenon in fairy lore, which is called Thieves in the Night. There you go, Josh. A little plug for you.
Appreciate it.
And I had just begun the idea for this book, and I knew I wanted to write something about all the strangeness that kind of goes along with Bigfoot. I didn't quite know how I was going to do it, but I knew I needed help. I knew there was so much there. Very shortly after getting into it, I knew there was so much there that I was going to need help. Josh and I have been on several podcasts together. Had we met? I don't think we'd even met by this time, but we'd been on different podcasts together, and we'd had email exchanges, and I'd sent him my books, and he'd sent me his books, and I liked his writing, and I knew it was somebody I could trust to put their heart into the project. So I asked Josh, like, you want to climb on board on this? And thankfully he agreed, and it changed, definitely. It's a different book in a better way now that Josh is involved. I was going to write it more almost as an encyclopedia of weird stuff associated with Bigfoot. Like, A is for albatwitch, B is for whatever, C, W is for witches, G is for glowing eyes, etc. And Josh really had a kind of a different angle he brought to it. And I think it ends up being a better book for that. So I'm glad we sort of changed the format. But there was just so much weird stuff, Wes, that it can't be ignored.
Yeah, I agree. Josh, what kind of weird stuff would someone find in the book regarding Sasquatch? What kind of odd things have you come across that you thought, we need to put this in the book?
Well, there's some things in the book that I wanted to address that have always bugged me as someone who believes that there is an objective reality to things like the Sasquatch phenomena. I still really do sympathize when people talk about not finding a body, people talking about, there not being anything that we can really call, proof with a capital P. So there are certain things that always sort of like made me really question the physicality of this, and things like cloaking, turning invisible, shape-shifting, being bulletproof. So what we really tried to do, Tim and I, is to sort of take a look at this Sasquatch phenomena through a bunch of different folkloric lenses in this volume. So while there's not dedicated chapters per se to things like bulletproof Bigfoot or, Bigfoot phasing through fences and stuff, they're nested within these different chapters. But what became apparent is that there are certain traditions, certain modalities of thinking that just really haven't been explored in terms of the Bigfoot phenomena. You look at the most attention that Bigfoot has gotten, and it's typically from people who are proponents of the flesh and blood hypothesis, the idea that Bigfoot is some sort of undiscovered relic primate. But whenever those individuals who are proponents of that try to look at the folklore, they tend to just focus on Native American folklore, and it's problematic for a number of reasons. Number one, they're just looking at North America, and number two, they tend to treat Native Americans as like some sort of monolithic giant culture, and that's just absolutely not the case. So what Tim and I think we really try to do is not only give each tribe's lore its own voice, but also look at it through the Western European wildman tradition, which I don't think anybody had really put their effort into. And looking at that tradition through almost like a Jungian lens of like a collective unconsciousness archetype. Like, as a human being born on planet Earth, you have certain archetypes that are embedded in your psyche, and one of those is the wild man. And the number of congruencies that you'll find between the outliers, the odd things in Bigfoot sightings, and that wild man archetype are really astounding. So in this book, which is just mostly focused on that folkloric aspect, we look at sort of window areas. We look at looking at Bigfoot through more of a poltergeist lens, looking at Bigfoot through a fairy folklore lens, or the little people lens, which is one of my specialities. Looking at Bigfoot through the alien contact experience, looking at it through a ritual magic experience, looking at it through this witch archetype of Western Europe, looking at it through basically the ghost archetype. I mean, there's an entire tradition of hairy ghosts, and then again, something that I never would have put together, this idea of this connection of women in white, the archetypal women in white, and the Bigfoot experience. So Volume 1's about folklore. Volume 2 will come out later this year, hopefully, and that's more focused on like actual evidence. But this is just saying, look at all these different other traditions that are describing similar things to Bigfoot. These creatures that jump on houses and slap the sides of the walls, and they make knocks in the forests, and they're hairy, and they have glowing eyes, and they do all these things that Bigfoot do, but they're not Bigfoot. So it really became apparent after working through this that, for me at least, that Bigfoot is yet another sort of cultural lens through which we try to describe a lot of these paranormal phenomena, at least for me. And I know there are going to be plenty of people who disagree, but some of these similarities are really strong, and they're difficult to ignore, I think.
Yeah, and like I was telling you guys before we came on air, I think that Sasquatch is very physical. I think that, it obviously leaves tracks, it craps, it, you can see trace evidence of where it's been, but that doesn't mean that there isn't odd things that go on. I haven't gotten to the section yet of Woman in White, and I wanted to ask you about that, Tim, because I know you wrote that section, and I saw Ape Canyon. And, when people first come into the, start investigating, kind of researching, looking things up regarding Sasquatch, they'll come across Ape Canyon. And if you read Fred Beck's account, I mean, to this day, I could be at an Ape Canyon in about an hour and a half, 2 hours. I could be in the middle of Ape Canyon, and it's called Ape Canyon. But the part of the story that most people don't pay attention to was what Fred wrote when he was recounting that story. And he talks a lot about a lot of weird things that went on, more than it just being an ape. But no one ever addresses that. But if you read the rest of what he wrote, he talks a lot about a lot of weird things that went on up there.
Absolutely.
Tell me about that section, the Woman in White and the Ape Canyon, and you can address the Ape Canyon section if you want.
Well, the Ape Canyon thing falls under the Women in White section because it has a Women in White connection, at least by name. And Fred Beck, he was one of the miners that was there. And everyone who's into Sasquatch has heard of Ape Canyon, I think. A lot of people have read about it. If you buy a book that's a general survey of Bigfoot, it'll usually have some mention of the Ape Canyon story in it. And every Bigfoot book I've ever read makes it sound like a guy shot at a Bigfoot, and then a bunch of Bigfoot came back later that night and attacked the cabin, and that was pretty much it. But Fred Beck was one of the miners who was there. And he has a far stranger story to tell. And I have a quote from him in the book, which I absolutely love. And he says, "First of all, I'll say that they are not entirely of this world." By they, he meant the Bigfoot. "I know the reaction we experienced as these beings attacked our cabin impressed many with the concept of great ape-like men dwelling in the mountains. And I can say that we genuinely fought and were quite fearful, and we were glad to get out of the mountains. But I was, for one, always conscious that we were dealing with supernatural beings, and I know the other members of the party felt the same." So there's a lot of what Josh and I have begun to call weird washing in the Bigfoot community, where they take these stories and they cherry pick the parts that make them seem most like natural animals, like apes in the woods, and they throw out all the weirdness. So with respect to Ape Canyon, it started when these guys saw a giant, what they called a giant Indian spirit, a Native American spirit, which told them to follow a white arrow through the wilderness. They follow this white arrow. Along the way, they meet another spirit, a woman who they called Vander White. They don't describe her, but they said she was, they named her Vander White. And then they follow this arrow onto the mine, which they named the Vander White Mine. They named it after this female spirit they met. While they're there, before any of the stuff that everybody knows about with the shooting the Bigfoot and the attack later on, they experience a number of weird things, including strange sounds coming from the ground, like a rhythmic kind of drumming. They find 2 footprints in the middle of the sandbar. They said just an acre-wide sandbar, and there's just 2 footprints down the middle. They could not figure out how the footprints got there. One of the other miners, not Fred Beck, but one of the ones that was with him, said it looked like they picked something up and dropped it down and picked it up again. There was a port, so these happen in poltergeist experiences. Things just appear or disappear. But he had a pencil appear in his hand. He said he knew it was at his house. He needed a pencil, and a pencil appeared in his hand out of nowhere. So there's all this strangeness that goes along with this case that's just been washed away, and you never hear about it. I know when we were talking before, Wes, you said, that's one of the first things you brought up when I was talking to you about this book. You're like, have you read Fred Beck's Ape Canyon account? I was like, yes, I have, absolutely. It's amazing. But this Woman in White chapter, I'm going to blame Sasquatch Chronicles for this, Wes. This started with it's the We Need Help episode that I think myself and the fans usually just call the Two Brothers episode. And, they were seeing a number of Bigfoot creatures and having the very typical stuff with, Bigfoot slapping the house and climbing on the roof and doing all that. But then you gave an update on a later episode, and you said, they're seeing this really weird woman, this like hag-like woman who's walking around the neighborhood. She's tall and she's wearing white, and she's wearing shoes that are too big, look like they're too big for her feet, which is a very important detail, by the way. We'll get into that. And some people in the Sasquatch Chronicles, the forum, started saying, oh, you know what? I've seen a weird woman in white, and I drove down the road, and I saw a Bigfoot then. And I thought, well, okay, that's weird. Now that more than one person is reporting this. So I started just on my own kind of keeping track, and I met with a witness. I think I mentioned it on Strange Familiars once that I was kind of interested in this idea. And a Bigfoot witness said, hey, I'd like to meet you at Michaud Forest where I had, a couple encounters, and I want to show you something there. I said, absolutely. So we met there. It's a forest here in Pennsylvania, and he takes me to a place called Pond Bank. And he says, the reason I'm taking this, he said, we're less than a mile away from, he had two sightings. One he got roared at, and another he saw a black Bigfoot, one of the blacker than black accounts. He said it was I'm sure you've taken reports of them, Wes, where people just say they look blacker than black, blacker than the night around them. Yeah.
Yeah, like they almost like they suck up the light.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
Yep. So it was one of those, and they were both less than a mile away from this area in Pond Bank. He said, now this area is famous for, there's a woman in white spirit here. They call her the White Lady of Pond Bank. So then I said, oh, okay, now this is very interesting. I'm getting several cases now. But I started going back in folklore then, and I'll just take a moment to say, I say this in most every interview, I think it's important. I've heard a lot of the cryptozoologists, the self-anointed cryptozoologists, use the term folklore in a very dismissive way. They'll say, like, oh, that's just folklore. Like it leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And I think that's a mistake. I think there's a lot of truth that's passed down through the folk process. For instance, the easiest example is like, this plant will heal you and this plant will kill you. These are things that have been passed down in folk tales and folk stories over the years. And I think these folk stories, they get exaggerated, they get changed a little bit, but the essential truth is still there. And what it is, it's our relatives, from the past, our ancestors, telling us how they dealt with these weird things a lot of the times. And a lot of these things are very important because you can learn a lot of lessons from the way our relatives dealt with the things that were like Bigfoot, which they wouldn't have called Bigfoot. They would have called them wild men, or before that, they would have called them wadwos or something else. So I started looking at folklore for these women in white, and going back in time, I found this woman from Germany. They said she was the Teutonic moon goddess, but she's really a lot more like Baba Yaga, the witch from Russian folklore, and her name is Perkta. And the interesting thing about Perkta is she would call children from the wilderness. She says she was very interested in children, just like Bigfoot reports. If they followed her, they'd never come back. So she'd lead them into the woods, they'd never come back. She was said to be an old hag woman who either wore white or she could appear also as a young woman in white. They said Perkta had either 1 or 2 feet that were too big for her body. Now, if you remember the woman from the Two Brothers episode, they said she was wearing shoes that looked like clown shoes, like too big for her. And the reason this Perkta wore that or had the big feet, they said, is because she had bird feet. Now, this is something that Josh pointed out to me. If there's a problem in the Bigfoot community with three-toed tracks, and a lot of people say, well, it doesn't make sense. A primate shouldn't have three-toed tracks, etc. But if you think of a bird foot, what it would look like, now they actually have 4 toes, but the 4th toe is facing backwards. The appearance of a bird's track is as 3 toes. But in any case, this Perkta had this retinue. She had these 2 groups that followed her around. And one is called the Heimchen, and the Heimchen were the souls of dead children, but they took the form of will-o'-the-wisp lights, so orbs in the woods. And the other group that followed her around were called the Perkton, and they were a group of hairy wild men that would run into, would scare people in the towns and throw rocks and climb on their roofs and do all the things that Bigfoot does. So here we have, back in German folklore, pre-medieval times, we have this association with this Perkta and strange lights in the forest and hairy wild men. And I went from there and I started looking at folklore all over the world. And in North Africa, all throughout Europe, in Russia, I haven't found any explicitly in the Far East yet, but I think it's just a matter of time. But time after time after time, there's notes of these wild men, these big hairy creatures, and they say they'll call them their wife or their significant other will be a woman in white, either a woman in white or a white creature similar to them. But again and again, you have this idea of the wild man, and next to him is a woman in white. There's a couple examples. The apple tree man in England, they said he was a wild man that guarded the orchard. And he is helped in this by, they said, the ghost of a haggy woman who wears white, an old woman who wears white. There are the Sasquatch, I think is in Apollonia, was known as the friend of witches. And his counterpart was this woman in white, this very tall woman in white. So it appears in folklore all over the world that the wild men are associated with these women in white. And I don't know why, I can't tell you why, but I can tell you the connections are there, absolutely.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up, Tim. I kind of got chills as you were talking because, the two brothers, they told me that woman in white was pretty tall. I mean, it wasn't like a short woman running around. It was a pretty big woman running around. And I always wondered why, they brought up that detail of, like, clown shoes. She was wearing, and it didn't hit them till later that she never got dirty. They're wearing snake boots and they have mud up to their shins walking around on that property, and she was never dirty. But she appeared to be very physical. And I always wondered why, because later in the story, as you guys know, it really wasn't a human woman out running around. It was some sort of entity. But I always thought that was a weird detail they left me, that she looked like she wore clown shoes. Her shoes were too big. And I could never pinpoint why would, if you're going to be a spirit, why not have, decent pair, if you're going to have shoes, at least have them fit. But they said they were like clown shoes out running around.
So if I could interject two axes that I have to grind personally, it's the idea that, like, obviously, as Tim has outlined here, the Ape Canyon incident has a lot of factors that aren't always presented. I personally find it, as someone who's interested in a lot of these subjects, I personally find it intellectually dishonest to cherry pick the aspects of someone's encounters to fit your, large hairy hominid, undiscovered monkey in the woods hypothesis. Like, if you believe that Fred Beck was there and he was encountering something was assailing the cabin with him and his folks, then you've got to take that incredible encounter alongside other incredible claims that he makes as well. I mean, we all live in glass houses. It's so ironic to me that the UFO people think that the Bigfoot people are crazy, and the Bigfoot people think that the UFO people are crazy, and the ghost people think that they're both crazy. It's just it's so silly. But something that you spoke to a little bit earlier, Wes, was the idea that, like, I really wish if people can leave this particular interview with anything in their minds, please decouple the idea that things have to be physical or non-physical. If you look at the people who believe in ghosts, I think we would all agree that ghosts are non-physical in some sense. They're probably spirits of the dead, although there's a lot of people who would argue otherwise. But they're probably the spirits of the dead, and they can pass through walls and do all these things, but they still interact with our physical world. The non-physical interacts with our physical world. They can leave footprints, they can leave handprints, they can shut doors, they can move objects, etc. And this is something that's borne out over the past, I would say, 20, 25 years in terms of psi phenomena, where people are actually able, in the laboratory settings, to influence the physical world with their minds. So even though something may have physical imprints or physical leave physical evidence in our world, doesn't mean that it's not necessarily, it has to be one thing or the other. I would almost compare things like Bigfoot hair and Bigfoot scat to something like ectoplasm, which is, something that was commonly manifested in seances where people were trying to contact, the spirits of the departed. This ephemeral sort of goop that would just sort of materialize out of nowhere. Or if you look at the UFO phenomena, which I personally contend is less physical than than most people think. There's a whole phenomenon of this sort of angel hair that's left behind. This sort of film, this sort of almost like steel wool that people can gather at the sites, but even when they put them in jars, they tend to evaporate and dissipate. And of course, UFOs leave burn marks and radiation effects on witnesses as well. So I would really like for people to stop thinking in this sort of dualistic physical versus non-physical way and just be like, there's something that can perhaps pass through those different boundaries, and it just is. Let's stop trying to place these physical, non-physical, dimensional, whatever labels on it, and just say it is. But it traffics in different ways than Wes or Tim or Josh does.
Yeah, I mean, to simplify what Josh said, and if I'm out of line here, Josh, just correct me. We believe like this; these are real things,
yes,
and they are leaving real footprints, and they are leaving real hair behind. But there's something very, very strange about them, and that's the most simplified version I can give of what Josh just said.
Well, and going back to Christians, for example, the spiritual, as a Western culture, because I struggled with that for the longest time, like Dogman. I cannot wrap my head around Dogman. It seems to be bulletproof. It seems to show up. It seems to go after people the same way, almost like a demon would. When a demon generally, and Josh will correct me if I'm wrong, but generally a demon will focus in on one person. They'll kind of attach themselves to one person. But going back to the spiritual side of it, in the Bible, for example, most Christians believe the Bible. And I think as a Western culture, we've taken this as something spiritual can't be physical, but that's not really true. I mean, even in the Bible, who did Abraham sit down and eat with? These three angels. That's if you believe the Bible. Mm-hmm. And then two of them showed up in Sodom and Gomorrah and grabbed Lot and his wife by the arm and dragged him out of there. Now, they weren't humans. They weren't something physical, but they were. Even though they were spiritual, they were physical.
And great example. Yeah.
Well, to flip this on its head, for those of you who are believers, because I'm a Christian myself, if you believe that your actions in this reality have repercussions in the afterlife, repercussions with you and your God, then why would not the actions of another reality have repercussions in our reality as well? It's sort of a like I said, it's like an axe to grind with me, where I think that we tend to try to separate these things a lot more than I think they really are separated. If there is an objective reality to things like Bigfoot, which I tend to believe there are.
Do you guys address the smell in a lot of encounters? How there's that weird smell that witnesses report?
So I mentioned it briefly. There are a lot of strong correlations between the smells of ghosts and the little people and demons and the smells that people report in Sasquatch encounters. We don't necessarily address that at length in this volume because I wrote a book in 2016 called The Brimstone Deceit, where a full third of that book is dedicated to just looking at Bigfoot smells and cataloging the types of smells that are noticed and what they can mean, how they could be produced. So because I did that, I didn't want to copy and paste into this new book. As far as I'm aware, I think that what I wrote in The Brimstone Deceit is probably the most that someone's ever written about Bigfoot smells, but it's not necessarily part of this volume. But there are definitely similarities. I mean,
well, the smells are addressed in the Wilderness Guys chapter.
Yeah.
I mean, they're addressed a few places throughout, but there's not a dedicated chapter or spot for it, at least in volume 1.
So I say they're not addressed because I wrote an entire book obsessing over this, right? So I could have said a lot more. Smells are sort of my thing. So I could have said a lot more, but most of that's in my 2016 book, The Brimstone Deceit. But there is this. I wouldn't even say that it's occurs in every case, but the rotten egg, sewage, hydrogen sulfide, that sort of funky fart smell, for lack of a better term, that occurs in a lot of these cases is something that you find across all sorts of paranormal phenomena. You'll find it in demon accounts, you'll find it in ghost accounts, you'll find it in the UFO literature as well. I would argue that it is by far the most prevalent odor that you find in accounts with the paranormal in general. And hydrogen sulfide has some specific and very peculiar aspects to it that make it possibly a vector for inducing hypnosis or inducing an altered state, which is something I go into in the Brimstone Deceit. But it's definitely one of those commonalities that I think is really underreported. For me, I know that so part of the reason that this book works so well, I think, is because Tim's really a field researcher and I'm more of a stay-at-home shut-in academic, for lack of a better term. But for me, the things that I always really find interesting are the ways that people from very different cultures across completely different time spans, somebody from today versus, somebody in Thailand in, 1750 or whatever, they'll describe certain things that sound almost identical, and it's the consistency between these accounts that I think really strengthens the case that we're dealing with something objectively real versus the veracity of any individual account on its own footing.
Yeah, I know in the Bigfoot world, when they talk about smells, they'll say it's an ape, and it's because of this gland underneath their armpit, and so that's why and I just have a hard time buying into that. And the reason why I have a hard time buying into that is because of how it's reported. It's not reported like, oh, I started smelling something weird, and then as I got closer, it got stronger. That's not how the smell's reported. It's like, bam, you walk into a wall of it.
Yep. It's like a flipping a switch, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I've experienced that. Like where you could walk through it, turn around, and walk back through it. Very, very bizarre.
Yeah, there was a thing I was going to send both of you guys. You guys would be fascinated by it. I don't know that anyone else would care, but it was a scientist, and he was talking about how all these different dimensions, and it's actually proven through science that there is more than one dimension. I can't remember how many there are, but he's way smarter than I am. He goes through and explains it, and he was talking about aliens, and he was talking about demons. He never got into Bigfoot, but he was talking about those two specific topics, and the reason why you smell that weird smell is as they're coming into our reality, there is an after effect. There is a what's the word he used? Almost like a I knew I shouldn't have opened my mouth about this.
But speaking specifically to what you're speaking about, the introduction of light or energy into a certain environment with the chemicals can cause a photochemical reaction of all sorts of different varieties. So yeah, it's almost like as a byproduct of the transition, there are sort of these side effects that manifest as smells.
Yeah, and that's kind of what he was going into, how it was a byproduct from entering into our reality. And, it's not just crazy talk. I mean, science has proved there's several different dimensions that we live in a certain dimension, and, but it was fascinating to listen to him talk about this smell and how it's a byproduct from them coming into our reality. And again, he's smarter, way smarter. It's above my pay grade talking about it, but it caught my ear when he was saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that exact report, but that's one of the theories, I think, that the smell is produced somehow. And again, you want to go back to biblical accounts, they would talk about the smell of brimstone, associated with usually demonic entities. Again, this is where Josh lives. He's literally written the book on it, but it's there. I mean, that again, what exactly it means, it's very frustrating to write all this and to not have answers for people in a way. For me to I'm not going to tell you it's an interdimensional creature because I don't know. I'm not going to tell you it's a demon. I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is it's much weirder, in my opinion, much, much weirder than an undiscovered ape. That's all.
Yeah, let me ask you, Josh, as you look across these different genres, what are the most common things that you see correlations between let's say Sasquatch, aliens, and demons, is there any aha moments where you're like, that's strange, I find that here, here, and here?
Well, for anybody who sort of follows my work, I have a very difficult time after looking into this of separating out the extraterrestrial contact experience and the little folk, the fairy folklore experience. That's sort of, I'm coming out of a tradition that was sort of established by Jacques Vallée, drawing those parallels. But the deeper I go into it, the more I see that not that fairies are aliens or aliens are fairies, but these are two sort of masks to describe these phenomena specifically. The way that those sort of interface with Bigfoot, one of the biggest things is the idea of the braiding of horse manes. I mean, this was a phenomena that was very commonly recorded in Western Europe, and it was often attributed to fairies or witches. Especially in the case of fairies, the idea that they would sort of like fashion like tiny little bridles for them to just ride on the horses' necks. The skeptic in me says that this is just people who aren't, brushing their horses' manes every night. But that's something that's an anomaly that's been taken up in a big way by the Bigfoot community. People talk about Bigfoot braiding horses' manes, and to be fair, there are accounts of people who have seen large hairy hominids actually like interacting with horses and braiding their manes. The other thing that I find really interesting, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, Wes, is the time dilation, the missing time thing. So if anybody doesn't know what missing time is, missing time is the idea that if you are taken to fairyland, you feel like you spent 4 hours there, but you've really spent 4 years there. And this manifests itself in parallel with the alien abduction experience of people who feel like they should have taken, 30 minutes to get home, and 4 hours later they're finally home. And then they have a hypnotic regression, or they have memories, and they realize that perhaps their journey was interrupted in some sense. I remember with you and your brother, there was an incident where your incident, your big sort of sighting, the amount of time that you estimated during which it happened was a lot shorter than the actual amount of time that elapsed, if I recall correctly from one of your early interviews.
Yeah.
And that sort of smacks of that missing time thing. Like, I think you felt like it should have taken 40 minutes and it was actually 4 hours. That's kind of strange. And there was someone on your podcast who said that, whenever you're in a stressful situation, you think that time passes slower, but that's not the case, as backed up by reams of scientific studies. Whenever you're in a stressful situation, time feels like it's passing faster. So you should have felt every moment of that, but you came home feeling like you spent less time than you actually did. So, not to put you on the spot, but that's one of those things, that missing time thing. And there's plenty of missing time accounts in Bigfoot accounts. It's one of those underreported things where people feel like, I saw a Bigfoot and it took me 3.5 hours to walk the half mile back to my truck. I don't know why it did, but it did. So that time dilation thing is something that I think is vastly underreported, but it's still there if you look at these accounts.
Yeah, it's strange. I have no explanation for it. It still bothers me to this day. I mean, there wasn't, I don't remember any aliens coming down, there was no reason for us to, feel that way, but it is strange. I've talked to a few people that have experienced that, and I don't have a great explanation for the time, and I know Woody and I got goofed on a lot for that whole thing, but it's what happened. I can't tell you regarding the time. It's so weird, man. It's so weird. Even today, if you ask Woody, he almost doesn't want to quite talk about that because.
But what I'm saying is that it's, whereas other people would see that as a hole in your story, there are people who look at this holistically throughout all sorts of fairy folklore and alien abduction folklore, who would say, no, this is entirely consistent with an encounter with something that is from the other realm, right, Tim?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's just one of those boxes to check, and to me, it makes me both like and believe Wes's account that much more, because
100%,
it's this bizarre detail that, you could have left it out. You could have not told that detail, but you include it. Like you said, that's what happened, and it just makes me believe it all the more.
Yeah, it's bizarre. You know, when I had Gary Wayne on, I don't know I think you know about Gary Wayne, don't you, Tim?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, if you ever get a chance, Josh, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Gary Wayne. He wrote this book called Genesis 6, and he has a whole section on fairies. And what's fascinating in fairy folklore is they fly around in flying machines, they kidnap people, and then they drop them off. The whole fairy concept, it sounds like they're talking about aliens is what they're talking about, but they're calling them fairies in his book. Is that kind of what you're addressing them as, Josh, when you talk about fairies?
I mean, so for me, the three main characteristics that you've got to sort of look at when you're categorizing something as fairy is, generally speaking, because this is not entirely consistent across cultures, but short stature, living underground, likes to abduct children. That's the thing. A lot of my influence in terms of my own research, and especially I think an influence for this book as well, came out of sort of the Jacques Vallée tradition of the 60s, where he started looking at the UFO phenomena versus the fairy phenomena and saying, hey, look, these things have a lot of similarities, but the fairy umbrella is so broad. I often compare it to sort of like Pokemon, because it's not just like people say fairies and they're like, oh, it's like Tinkerbell with wings. Well, let's set aside the fact that, fairies with wings are sort of perhaps a Shakespearean play invention. Fairies could fly, fairies could levitate other people, but they weren't really shown with wings. Fairies were elves, they were mermaids, they were ogres, they were trolls, they were all these things. And, on the one hand, that was a way that people of that time would describe the supernatural. They'd say, oh, that's fairy. But on the other hand, it's such a strong framework through which you can view a lot of this activity. I stand adamantly beside the fact that anything involved in the UFO contact experience, the alien contact experience, you can find a parallel between that and fairy folklore, and vice versa in a lot of ways. The thing that frustrates a lot of people that I talk to is, so are aliens fairies or fairies aliens? And I'm like, I'm not saying either. I'm saying that depending on your culture, you're grafting this sort of amalgamation of cultural beliefs upon whatever this other thing is, because it's something beyond our comprehension in a lot of ways. I would argue, but yeah, I mean, it's the whole fairy folklore thing, the whole fairy shtick, for lack of a better term, is still with us to this day in ways that we don't even realize. I mean, if someone has a stroke, the etymology, the sort of word origin for that term is because when people would have a stroke in, the 1800s, they would have suffered from the fairy stroke. Like the fairies had touched them, and that's why they had a stroke. The color cobalt is a derivative of the idea that there were fairies in the mines in Cornwall that were called kobolds, or actually Germany, sorry, Germanic mine fairies that were blue and would sort of float around the mines. They were colored this bright blue, and that's literally where you get the term cobalt, not only for the mineral but also for the color. And also, don't bogart that joint. Well, bogart comes from boggart, which is something that would steal, and it was a fairy that would steal stuff, and it's also where boogeyman comes from. And it's also where booger comes from. The Bigfoot booger is a direct derivative of the boogeyman, which is a direct derivative of the boggart, the little fairy that would come and snatch people in the middle of the night. So fairy lore is absolutely as vibrant as it ever was. It's just not as much on the surface.
It's kind of more of a generic term that they would use, it sounds like, as opposed to fairy means alien, is what you're saying. Yeah, no,
it's fairy was to say something was fairy or it was of fairy is the equivalent of saying it's supernatural, it's paranormal, it's this or that or the other. Yeah. 100%, yeah.
I gotcha. And I know there's a section, I think it's cool that you guys wrote different sections. You know, each one of you kind of have your own expertise in different areas. And it's cool that you guys wrote different sections of the book. Tim, you wrote a section on gifting. When the reader reads that section, what will they walk away from reading the section on gifting?
The gifting thing, you know, I think a lot of the flesh and blood folks have this idea that when you're gifting, you'll hear a lot of people say, you know, don't give Bigfoot food because they will become reliant on your food and then they will get mad if you stop giving them food. Maybe. But if you go back in time and you look at spirit gifting, which is something that people did, you know, as far back as we have records, this is consistent with that, where people would give offerings to the fairies, to various spirits all over the world. The most simple one to point out is Santa Claus. We leave Santa Claus milk and cookies. That's our spirit offering to Santa Claus, and he brings his presents, right? That's a long-standing tradition of spirit offering. Santa Claus is, by the way, in the wild man tradition, but that's another story, although I do know it. But the idea that the Bigfoot would grow dependent upon a couple candy bars left on a stump is very ludicrous to me, because if these are natural creatures, you know, 8 foot tall, maybe 1,000 pounds, you're not making a dent in the caloric needs of that with a candy bar on a stump. Something that big has to eat constantly. Gorillas have to eat constantly. They do not process their food. We do not have to eat constantly, big brain primate, humans, because we process our food. We cook it. We get the most bang for our buck out of the calories by processing our food. Gorillas do not, and they have to eat all day long. And in fact, if they were as big, if they had a brain as big as ours, they'd need another, I think, hour and a half of foraging per day just to get enough calories to live. So we were talking about something like Bigfoot, which is bigger than a human, bigger than a gorilla. It would need calories constantly. And if it's not processed food, if it's not cooking its food, and we can assume it's not because the forests aren't, you know, all aglow with Bigfoot campfires, and then it would just need to eat constantly, and it would need to eat in quantities far greater than a couple candy bars left on a stump. So when people say, oh, I left candy bars and I stopped leaving candy bars, and Bigfoot got mad and he pounded on my house and climbed on my roof and you know, screamed at me and everything else that goes along with these stories, again, maybe. But if you go back and look at spirit gifting throughout time, this is consistent. When you start giving spirits food, other gifts, and you stop, bad things happen. We have stories in the book of, I think it was a brownie, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, who the farmer stopped giving food to and it killed his cows. Is that?
Don't give the mouse a cookie, basically.
Yeah.
On the Isle of Inch, yeah.
Yeah. And there's other stories of, you know, if you're kind and you keep feeding the fairies beer, they will keep your house nice. If you stop, they will destroy your house. You know, there's these stories go on and on and on, and the idea is intention. So I've heard other people say, plant a Bigfoot garden. This is one of my favorite examples. If you have a garden and you want Bigfoot to stay out of your garden, you plant a Bigfoot garden closer to the woods, and the Bigfoot will know that this garden is for them, and they will only eat out of the Bigfoot garden. That is not the way nature works. Animals are caloric opportunists. Any other animal would now say, okay, now I've got 2 places to get food from. Great. All the more for me. But somehow Bigfoot knows this is a Bigfoot garden. Well, that's intention. And now you've set up a specific space for Bigfoot, and you're giving Bigfoot, you know, this intentional offering of this Bigfoot garden. So there's a lot of intention involved in gifting. And when things go wrong, it's because there are these rules that folklore establishes, and they've established them a long time ago. And it pretty much checks these same boxes again, where, you know, people in these old folk stories, they would stop giving gifts for whatever reason, and these supernatural creatures of various sorts would then harass them or hurt them or hurt their livestock, et cetera, et cetera. Same tale told about Bigfoot today. So I think the takeaway from that chapter is intention. It involves that people are leaving things out with intention. I give example of some of the flesh and blood folks say that it doesn't matter if Bigfoot's eating from your trash can, because that's your trash can, and he's eating from everybody's trash can. But if you leave them food out on a stump, that is bad news, because then you're leaving out. Well, that's intention. You've shown intention that, again, if this is just a wild creature, how does it know the difference that a trash can isn't a spiritual, place where you're leaving spiritual offerings of food for it, and the stump isn't the place where you discard your trash? It wouldn't know. Logically, it wouldn't know. So it's this idea of intention, even the flesh and blood folks assign to gifting. So I would say, take away intention, and also the idea that spirit offering is something that people have done for a long time. And I think that's probably what's going on with that tradition where people are doing that. I think it's very much a spirit offering.
To further emphasize that, I mean, if you look at sort of the way that magical practitioners interface with spirits, casting aside the sort of judgment of whether or not that should be something they should do, whatever. But the people that I've talked to who claim to have had interactions with spirits who are magically operant describe things that are strikingly like Bigfoot interactions. The spirits respond to invocations, vocalizations or knocks in the woods. They're more likely to manifest in areas of remote human activity. They show their presence through environmental effects. So, like, you're not going to actually see a spirit when you call the spirit by name. You're going to have, like, knocks and things being thrown at you and just, sort of interface with the environment. And they're often felt more than they're seen, which is something that, I've heard you talk about, Wes, is the idea that, like, when they're around, you feel it. Like, you feel it more than you actually see it sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. What you were saying, Josh, I mean, even talking about, like, Ouija boards, what do people always say? Like, knock on the table if you're here, or you hear ghost hunters do that, where they're like, if you hear, tap twice on the wall or whatever. And what you were saying, Tim, with regard to gifting, I mean, look at Halloween and Trick or Treat. If you ever get a chance to look that up, I mean, that is a creepy ritual. Hate to ruin Halloween, but it's a creepy ritual that we do. Yeah. There's a reason why you knock on someone's door and they give you candy, and why you say trick or treat. It's fascinating with the two brothers, and when they had the spirit medium lady come out to get rid of the Sasquatch, she was saying, don't give them anything and don't take anything from them. You're not feeding a wild animal. They see it as a tribute. And that always stuck with me when she said that. It always kind of unnerved me when she said that.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a long-term sort of gifting situation with something in the woods. I don't know what it was, right? And I amped it up.
Chessboard.
I amped it up, and I started, leaving food, and I started leaving then alcohol, and I asked for something. I asked for a skull, right? Because I've collected them since I was a kid, and I thought, wouldn't that be neat? And I'd read a story about someone doing that, and I got it. I walked 200 yards from the place where I asked for it, and I walked into this copse of trees, and there was a groundhog head. There was a freshly killed groundhog. It had the jaw ripped off, and the head laying there, and it was. I got my skull. It was covered in gore, but and I didn't take it. I backed out. I was very scared. It very much freaked me out. And then a bunch of bad stuff happened. It's like too long to go in, but a bunch of bad stuff happened in the same area, ending with a rabid raccoon attack.
But what did that copse of trees remind you of, Tim?
It would have, if it was in Ireland, it would have been called a fairy fort, Josh.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
It was a circle of trees with a big pile of stone in the middle of it. But in any case, this a bunch of bad stuff happened, and it ended with this rabid raccoon attack, and which maybe not, but according to folklore, and I'll never do this again. I'm going to go point this out. Like, this was on me. I made the mistake. But if you look at the folklore, it says, don't ask for anything. But if you do ask for something and it's given to you, take it, because they will get offended if you don't. Well, I didn't take it because I was grossed out. I didn't want like a gory, freshly killed groundhog head. I wanted a nice, clean, old skull that had been sun bleached. But I didn't say that. And, a bunch of bad stuff happened. So is this because is this spirit gifting going wrong? I don't know, but I can only say, like, if I look at the rules of folklore, I broke the rules, and then a whole bunch of bad stuff happened, and I'll never do it again. You know what I mean? But the rules are explicit in folklore, and I broke them. So, there's something to all this stuff. I don't know. Well, it's very difficult to talk about.
And this is something you've pointed out too, Wes, is that like the people who have like the hunter in the woods who sees Bigfoot walking across his prime, deer path, those are of a different category than people who are dealing with this phenomenon on their property day after day after day.
Yes.
And that speaks to me as something that might be sort of a window area, might be sort of something more akin to like a haunting. I'm not saying that Bigfoot is a ghost. Like we're Tim and I are super agnostic about what Bigfoot is. Like, if you try to like sort of reach a conclusion at the end of this book, you're going to be SOL. But I think that there's something really interesting to be said about like the way that the amount of interactions that you have with this phenomena tend to color the way that the phenomena acts. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it is strange. I mean, and you're right, Josh. I mean, your average person that runs into Sasquatch runs into an ape. They run into a very flesh and blood, giant something. But when you start getting on people's property for whatever reason, and not even people who are interacting with Sasquatch, they just start to notice them on their property. They'll really start to describe odd things, and they'll start.
Absolute.
I think out of, gosh, I can't even tell you how many people. Out of all the people I've asked, for example, the lights. I think I've only had one guy tell me no, he hasn't seen the lights, and I'm sure it's just a matter of time. But
yes,
everyone I talked to, when I first started asking people that, I just would ask them that out of the blue. I was just curious, and I was shocked how many people would pause on the phone and go, "Yeah, how did you know?" And it's like, I don't know, but so many people have told me that. And I don't know the correlation between the lights and Sasquatch. There is some weird, it's a very uncomfortable coincidence, the lights and Sasquatch.
I have my lights chapters in book 2. We get into there's a little bit of everything in both books. So there's, book 1 isn't exclusively folklore. There's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of examples of Bigfoot stories we go into. So there's a lot of everything in both books, but there's a dedicated chapter to the lights in book 2. And there's so much. There's just so much to choose from. Someone at some point could probably write a 10,000 or 100,000 word book just on lights and Bigfoot.
If I might be allowed to interject real quick, there is an 1880 book that has a quote that I'm very fond of quoting because it blows my mind every time I read it. Wirt Sykes, who is a Welshman who wrote a book that was about British goblins. So this is obviously couched within fairy lore. But he's talking about these sort of anomalous lights, not only in sort of Breton, which is, sort of, if you had to like Anglicanize an aspect of France, Brittany would be sort of like the most English part of France that you could.
Yeah, it's Celtic.
Sort of yeah.
It's in France, but it's Celtic.
Yeah. But he collected this massive amount of folklore, and he has this quote that like sticks with me every time I look at it. I'm like, that's Bigfoot. So I'm going to read that verbatim. So there's some language in here that some people might not be entirely comfortable with, but it's verbatim read. The Breton Sand Yan Eted, St. John the Father, is a double ignis fatuus fairy carrying at its finger ends 5 lights which spin around like a wheel. So obviously this is describing, ignis fatuus, fool's fire, the will-o-wisp, sort of like these ghost lights, right? He goes on to say, the Negroes of the southern seaboard states of America invest this goblin, meaning a ghost light goblin, with an exaggeration of the horrible peculiarly of their own. They call it jack-ma-lantern and describe it as a hideous creature 5 feet in height, with goggle eyes and huge mouth, its body covered with long hair, and which goes leaping and bounding through the air like a gigantic grasshopper. This frightful apparition is stronger than any man and swifter than any horse and compels its victims to follow it into the swamp, where it leaves them to die. That's Bigfoot. It's Bigfoot. It's Bigfoot. It's Bigfoot and anomalous lights, right? It's right there. 1880. Bigfoot and anomalous lights, talking about African Americans seeing this in the southern seaboard states. And that's something that's nobody talked about it. Honestly, Wes, to be fair and to not sort of suck up, I think that you were sort of instrumental in like getting people to talk about the anomalous lights. But it's right there in the older text.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Josh. I mean, a lot of people see the lights. I think more people have seen the lights than they've seen Sasquatch. You know,
That's probably true. Yeah.
There's really no explanation for the lights. I mean, I even recorded one. If you guys want, I'll send it to you. Me and Woody recorded on night vision. It was this weird ball of light just sitting there, and I have no explanation for it. None. As far as, and I didn't want to get too, it made me nervous. It wasn't like I was terrified of it. It was actually kind of a pretty light, but it was bizarre just to be there in the middle of the forest. And it is fascinating when you start going through history. I started looking them up, and, you know, in World War II, they talked about Foo Fighters. You know, everyone thinks it's a band, but Foo Fighters, pilots talked about seeing them all the time. And they would screw with their instruments as they were flying around.
Yeah. So this is something that I think Tim sort of touched upon in his The Company They Keep essay, is that, like, these things tend to conglomerate together. I mean, like, so you have places across the country, because I'm just sort of being, you know, U.S.-centric here, but places across the country where you have high incidence of Bigfoot encounters and anomalous lights. And you'll also find that those are the places where people find like these large anomalous black cats. Lauren Coleman said that it was very easy to find, you know, these large black cats in areas of high Bigfoot sightings. And then you'll find, you know, you'll dig a little bit deeper and like, oh, this is where UFOs are sighted too. And it speaks to me, if this is an actual animal, it doesn't seem to me that it would necessarily congregate or, you know, sort of manifest in this area where all this other garbage happens, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point, and you wouldn't think that they would. You know, going back to a lot of questions that I have, you know, regarding why don't we find dead bodies, and I have a hard time with the status quo argument that you get on that, even though I like Grover Krantz, and, you know, he brings up a great point, but at that time, when Grover was saying, well, you never find bear bodies, you never find, which is true, you know, unless someone...
But people have, like, in the history of mankind, people have found bear bodies. Like,
well, it's rare. It's rare. I'll give him credit on that. Yeah. It's rare. But, you know, here in the Pacific Northwest, the forest will consume anything that's dead. Yes. I mean, you kill something and it's going to be gone within a week. My argument to that, Sasquatch is seen in Arizona. Sasquatch is seen in New Mexico. It's seen in... I had a Border Patrol agent on right there down... I've been down there where they saw it. And I can tell you right now, there's no forest down there. And so... so why aren't we finding dead bodies down there? You know, and going back to this subject, you know, and a lot of these self-proclaimed researchers, you know, they'll give you the status quo answer. As long as you don't ask any follow-up questions, you're okay. They're okay with, you know, the minute you start asking follow-up questions is where their argument falls apart. And, you know, Sasquatch is seen in Russia, it's seen in China, it's seen in Australia, all over the world, and everyone has a different name for it, but we're all kind of describing the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
And we haven't caught up with this thing? I mean, it's not a mouse we're trying to find. Well, this thing's enormous.
It's the universality of this that makes me think that it is internally generated. And I know that's probably a very controversial thing to say, but if you look at, again, sort of the Jungian idea of archetypes being something that people are just born with, like human being has to deal with, it makes sense that anywhere people are there, that you will find this sort of wild man archetype. The correspondences between Bigfoot and the wildman archetype of Western Europe are just astounding. And that's the thing that I think Tim really brought to this is Tim's like, let's look at this through the wildman archetype. And it never really occurred to me, but like the wildman archetype, and by archetype I mean like things like, the trickster, the mother, the goddess, the father, the warrior, those sort of archetypes, those sort of Jungian things. Tim said, let's look at this through that archetype, and it never fails to sort of yield greater depth. And I really thank Tim for that, for pointing me in that direction, because that was not something I was thinking about at all.
On the topic of bodies, Wes, the thing about that I talk about evidence, and again, this comes more in the second volume, but I talk about it in terms of like primary relics and secondary relics. If you think about relics from the church, so a primary relic would be a piece of the saint's hair, or the saint's fingernail, an actual part of the saint's body. A secondary relic is something the saint touched. So it's the saint's Bible, or the saint's prayer cloth, or the saint's garment, anything like that is a secondary relic. The best evidence we have for Bigfoot are secondary relics, are the footprints, and they're very, very compelling. The primary relics we have, the hair, the scat, the blood, it's very, very controversial, and no one can agree on it. First of all, it goes missing with an incredible frequency. Like this stuff disappears way more often than it should. Gets lost in the mail or otherwise disappears. But no one can agree on the primary relics at all. As in terms of a body, there's been a lot of hoaxes, I know. A lot of people have claimed they had a body and it ended up being a hoax. But there's also been a lot of people who've claimed to shoot one that seem very credible. Or they claim, and otherwise they have a body, one way or another. And every one of these bodies is gone. 100% of them. Now, they'll say either like the government black van came up and went away, took the body and drove it away, or another Bigfoot came out of the woods and grabbed the body and took it and buried it, or does whatever Bigfoot do with their bodies. I say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how or why those bodies disappeared. The fact is they're gone. We do not have access to them. We cannot observe them. We cannot do any experimentation on them. We cannot see them. They are gone. So it doesn't matter how they're gone. They're gone. The evidence has disappeared. One way or another, it's gone. So, if we're going to believe people see, giant ape men in the woods, then I think we're going to believe at least some of them when they say they shot them and killed them and dropped them. And then the answer is, or rather the question remains, where's the body? And they're all gone, 100% of them. Every single one throughout time that people have claimed to shoot is gone.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's like those two guys that always show up, and I started really looking into that, and I would have eyewitnesses. It's usually when someone has real evidence, something tangible, or they've been hurt. And one thing I found where, and I mentioned that one time to someone, they go, well, it sounds like the Men in Black. I go, yeah, kind of. They aren't as sexy as the Men in Black. I mean, these two guys sound like one's an ogre and one's kind of a, clean-cut, goofy guy. But, and they show up, even in Claire's encounter. In the beginning of the show, the English lady talking from Britain, she's talking about how if you listen to her encounter, these two guys show up. And what's weird is they show up throughout time. I mean, I could understand if, some guy told me that and it happened in the 70s. I'd be like, it's probably some government worker. What's weird is their description stays the same, and they show up throughout time, which I find very, very strange.
And that's strikingly consistent with Men in Black reports, because there's always this uncanny valley between, what people perceive and the way that they look. It's entirely consistent with that too.
I write about those guys again in volume 2, and the actual section is called "Plaid is the New Black," because one guy's always described as wearing a lumberjack shirt. So.
Yeah, the big guy. Yeah, it's fascinating. So the takeaway from the book, and again, the book is called Where the Footprints Ends, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. Definitely check it out on Amazon. Again, I love the cover whoever did the artwork did an amazing job.
That was me.
Was it really?
That was that was a Tim.
It's very, very cool. Very cool. And as I started reading it, it's typical. I've never read anything you've done, Josh, but typical Tim book. It's very well written. It's very well put together. It isn't something slammed together and just thrown up on Amazon. I mean, just from the little I've read from it, I can tell a lot of time and effort. And you guys reference the hell out of everything in this book, which is cool, which is really cool. But the biggest takeaway is you guys kind of look across all genres and you start to see common, very odd coincidences throughout all these different genres. Would you agree that that would be the biggest takeaway from this book?
I think that, like, Tim and I would both agree that, like, we're not beholden to any sort of interpretation of what this is. We're just saying that, like, it's reductive to say that it's just a giant monkey. There's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of traditions that inform these encounters, and these encounters sort of speak to a lot of these other traditions as well. So honestly, like, I don't think Tim and I would agree with what Bigfoot is, and I don't think we even have an idea of what Bigfoot is. Like, we're just throwing up our hands, honestly. But there are things that are consistent with other traditions that compel us to question exactly what we think. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, most simply, the one thing that this hopefully will accomplish, 2 volumes, 2 very thick volumes, these are not thin volumes. At the end of the day, the people that have knighted themselves cryptozoologists can no longer say, well, the weird stuff with Bigfoot barely ever happens, because we've filled 2 books with example after example after example. And when we're, like, say, when I'm talking about glowing eyes or when I'm talking about gifting, I'm not using every example that was out there. I'm picking 5 or 10 examples to illustrate my point, and that's that. If we wanted to be exhaustive, these books would have been, way, way thicker.
Yep. Yep.
Each volume would have been War and Peace plus. So no longer can things be said like, oh, weird stuff barely ever happens with Bigfoot, so you shouldn't talk about it. No, it happens all the time. It happens with great frequency, and it's just out there. It's there. So, like I said, hopefully these 2 volumes accomplish that. Things like, I've heard things like, oh, the 3-toed tracks, they rarely appear. They're sometimes down in the South and in Pennsylvania in the 70s, and that's that. No. They appeared all the way, all across the United States, including the Pacific Northwest. It's a problem when you're talking about, thinking of it as a primate. So, again, example after example, and I think, yes, we're looking at folklore throughout the world, and we're pointing out things like, one of my favorite things is the climbing on roofs. That I had no idea how many things climbed on roofs, these folkloric things, from trolls to Norse Draugr, which are kind of the Norse undead Vikings. All these different big hairy things climb on roofs. They're said to climb on roofs, including Perkta, that witchy woman I mentioned before, and her retinue, the Perktin, and these various other wild men. All they for some reason they all climb on roofs. It's a bizarre detail. Why do these folkloric things from all over the world climb on roofs? But they do, and so does Bigfoot. So, yeah, there's consistencies in the folklore throughout the world that make me think that people have been talking about the wild men that people were talking about in medieval times and in the 1800s and today in the form of Bigfoot are probably the same thing, maybe expressed a little differently because it might be somewhat influenced by culture and it might change over time. I know that's a very complicated answer, but I hope that gets to where I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, there's no agenda with it. I mean, you guys are just kind of laying out facts across the board, and people can make up their own mind. It's kind of like what John Bitternagel used to always tell me. He used to give me such a hard time. He would always tell me, you cannot pick and choose the people to put on your show. You have to tell the whole story. And he used to really beat me over the head with that. And he would say, you can't tell just part of the story. You got to tell the whole story. And if there's a weird part in someone's story, you got to include it because it might mean something more down the road, even though you can't explain it now, like the Sasquatch vanishing or the glowing red eyes. How could something see with glowing red eyes? That makes it must be eye shine. And most people you talk to, they're like, it wasn't eye shine. They were glowing up like light bulbs. And so, he really pushed me to that. And I would hope that it would draw us closer to more answers, but it seems like it's more questions. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, that's the problem. It's just going to be more questions. I don't think. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I hope at some point we figure it out. But I don't think we're going to figure it out in my lifetime.
That's the hope of every anybody who's interested in Bigfoot, even nominally, is we catch a Bigfoot. I'm sitting here, on a book and a half of weird Bigfoot stories, but I would love for tomorrow, Trump to be like, okay, coronavirus, but also we got Bigfoot, that'd be great. That'd be great. But you just got to sort of temper your expectations, I guess.
It doesn't mean I'm not interested in it. It doesn't mean I don't think they're real. I feel like I have to say it again and again. As I'm presenting all this stuff, I'm not saying I don't. I absolutely believe people. I've talked to enough witnesses. Yes. I've had my own experiences where I believe there's something very, very real behind this. Very, very physical. It's just very, very strange.
Yeah, it's like Dogman. Dogman, I think, is very real. I think people are running into it. I think it's an entity people are running into. But again, going back to what Josh was saying in the beginning, just because something is spiritual doesn't mean it can't be physical. And with the Dogman, it seems to dodge bullets. It seems to be bulletproof. But in the same breath, it has no trouble killing all your farm animals. It has no trouble banging on your house. It has no trouble following you around. It's bizarre. There's so many weird things in this world. Let me ask you, Josh, what do you think Sasquatch is? What's your opinion?
You always ask us. So my current line of thinking is kind of in line with the ideas of the late John Mack, who was a alien abduction researcher before he got hit by a bus in England, which is kind of sounds funny, but that's actually what happened. But he talked about the alien abduction experience, the hybrid program being sort of a reified metaphor. The idea of sort of a Jungian idea, a cultural concept made real. And that's where I am right now, is that we're drawing upon, I think that the witness is as much an important part of the Bigfoot sighting as whatever the Bigfoot sighting is, So I think that, if you ask me in 6 months, I hope that I have a different answer. But that's sort of where I am right now, is that we are definitely encountering something that is objectively in other intelligence, not human beings, not you projecting your psyche onto something. There's something objectively real at the end of this other experience, but I'm not entirely sure that it interacts with our physical reality in the same way that, me dropping a glass of water would interact with our reality. So that's sort of where I am. It's like this sort of Jungian wild man archetype. And that's sort of airy-fairy, but anyway, Tim, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so agnostic on it. Again, I've said it several times. I just think it's too weird to be an undiscovered gorilla. But looking at all this wild man stuff, I mean, wherever we've lived throughout time, we've had a wild man, and by we I mean humans, whatever culture. There's a wild man that lives in the woods beside us, and that's just a different way of saying what you said before, Wes. Australia has them, India has them, Europe has them, everybody has them. So it's something that's there, that's always been there. It's boy, I just have trouble saying it other than that it's very real but very weird, and that's as far as I feel like I can go with it. I think there's a lot of weight to the wild man archetype idea because UFOs have changed culturally over time. If you look at the old pictures of UFOs, you'll see them. They look like dirigibles. They look like balloons, and so forth. And up to the 50s, they kind of took like a Art Nouveau kind of, or Art Deco rather, kind of look to them.
Well, it's dragons and air balloons into, sort of like steampunk airships, into flying saucers, into black triangles, into what we now have with the Navy sightings, like these amorphous sort of,
almost like
UFO
plasma balls and stuff people are seeing now. And it seems, it's weird to talk about, but it seems like the wild man changes too. And it's almost like the reverse of that. So it's like the UFOs have gotten more sci-fi and more technological over time. This wild man archetype starts in the medieval times. He's just this wild wizard. He's hair covered and he lives in the woods, but he's a wizard and he has knowledge and so forth. And up to the 1880s, where there's a lot of reports of these guys wearing torn up clothes. They're big hairy guys that aren't human. They're wild men, but they're wearing like torn up clothes, or they're carrying like an old rusty musket or something. And to nowadays, where you get this very, very wild Bigfoot, and it's almost like it's kind of changing too. Like as we've gotten further away from nature, our wild man has gotten wilder. And I know that's a very, very strange concept, because it suggests in a way that these things aren't of themselves, that they're not natural. But like I said, the UFOs changed, and it seems almost like the wild men have changed too. It's very, very strange.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I never thought about that before, Tim. I hope everyone goes out and gets a book. Again, it's called Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness, and Bigfoot Phenomena. I got myself a copy. I hope you guys go out and get yourself a copy on Amazon. I'll throw a link underneath, and check out Tim's podcast, Strange Familiars. I post it every week for people who hit my website. They know about Tim. If you're just hearing Tim for the first time, definitely whatever podcast player you're listening to, go listen to Strange Familiars. I'm a huge fan of the show. Tim, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me back, Wes. Always a pleasure to be on Sasquatch Chronicles.
Pleasure was mine. And Josh, it was great meeting you, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I really do. I enjoyed talking to you, man.
Oh yeah, it's a highlight for my ear. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. Thanks again, guys. That's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. Until next time, everyone.